And we're going to get everyone that we can possibly evacuate until the clock runs out or we run out of capability.
And then we'll hope that the Taliban are nice. And the Taliban will be nice so long as we pay them American taxpayer dollars. It is the most mewling, pathetic, disreputable thing I've ever seen in my life in terms of American foreign policy, and it is not close. It's an absolute disaster in Afghanistan as far as getting people out. The NATO Secretary General said yesterday, well, NATO is telling the Taliban we expect them to provide safe passage. This is Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Well, as long as you guys are telling them that you expect them to provide safe passage, I'm sure the Taliban will do what you say. Or alternatively, the Taliban now hold all the cards. Because the United States decided to withdraw with no plan at all to even protect the American citizens on the ground, the Taliban hold all the cards. What happens if the Taliban just say no? Is the United States going to deploy thousands of troops into Kabul to go house to house to find the American citizens who are there? Do you think Joe Biden's going to do that? I don't. What are you going to do? Sanction the Taliban? They have no economy. What exactly is the threat here? You guys just abandoned the place, and then you're like, you better let out our guys. Why would they do that? The answer is they would do that if we bribe them. Okay, that is the next step here. The next step is that the Biden administration is going to send pallets of cash to the Taliban. And then Biden is going to say, look how they moderated. Look at that. They moderated. They let all of our people out. So really, this isn't that bad. I handled this beautifully. Everybody got out. And then a few weeks later, the Taliban will emerge from their caves to explain that, in fact, they were given billions of dollars by the Biden administration, hundreds of millions of dollars by the Biden administration in order to free what are essentially American hostages now in Afghanistan. And they will humiliate Biden. That is how this is going to play out, with like 75% certainty. Okay, anyway, here's the NATO Secretary General threatening with nothing.
Our diplomats on the ground, our people on the ground are working hard to enable those who are threatened, those who have worked for us, staff and others, to enable them to get to the airport. And we're also sending a very clear message to Taliban that we expect them to provide safe passage to enable people to get to the airport.
As of now, it seems like what you're saying is this depends on the good graces of the Taliban?
We don't control the territory outside the airport.
So yes, that's a yes. We are relying on the good graces of the Taliban. The Taliban have no good graces. The only reason that they release the Americans here is if they're paid off. That is the only reason. Because what exactly is Joe Biden going to do? Launch a bunch of airstrikes into the countryside? What exactly is NATO going to do at this point? Reoccupy? They're not going to do any of that stuff, and the Taliban know it. You just surrendered the country to a bunch of 8th century barbarian cavemen. And now you're like, maybe they'll be nice. By the way, Joe Biden is saying they will be nice. He is telling George Stephanopoulos, maybe they'll moderate. CIA analyst Matt Zeller, who's been on CNN a lot, he said, here's what the Taliban's actually doing. They're taking people's passports in Kabul. So if you show up with a passport to try and get past the barricade and get into the airport, they'll just take your passport from you.
We need to basically tell the Taliban that they need to shut down their checkpoints in the city because they're actively taking people's passports. I've had U.S. citizens who have had their U.S. passports taken from them, their green cards taken from them. Afghans are having their documentation stolen from them by the Taliban in an attempt to prevent them from being able to even get into the airbase.
Okay, meanwhile, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, right, the most powerful military presence in the history of the world, he says he's asked about evacuating Americans, and he can't guarantee that we will keep troops in there for long enough to even evacuate Americans. Look at the way he's hedging his bets here. This is reality, okay? When we say that we are going to evacuate 10 to 15,000 Americans, there are a bunch of Americans who are out there in the countryside. They ain't coming home. There are a bunch of Americans in Kabul. Many of those people will not be coming home. The Biden administration knows this because they blew it. They blew it all the way. Here is the Defense Secretary of the United States of America talking about how we cannot evacuate Americans thanks to a ragtag, backwater group of cavemen firing AK-47s and who were just handed billions of dollars in American military technology by a surrendering American pusillanimous president. This is so humiliating. It's the most humiliating thing I've ever seen in my life with regard to American foreign policy. I mean, it is not close. I think it may be the most humiliating thing any American has ever seen in their lifetime, period. And it took 2 years for the United States to, after the United States' large-scale withdrawal from Vietnam, it took about 2 years for everything to collapse in Vietnam. This took about 5 minutes. And now the United States is left begging and pleading with the Taliban to evacuate American citizens. Here's the defense secretary of the most powerful military power in the history of the world saying that, we'll try and get people out until the clock runs out. By the way, when he says until the clock runs out, that is a tacit admission that we are now working on the Taliban's timetable.
We're really working hard to get as many people through as possible. And quite frankly, it's obvious we're not close to where we want to be in terms of getting the numbers through. So we're going to work that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we're going to get everyone that we can possibly evacuate it. And I'll do that as long as we possibly can until the clock runs out or we run out of capability.
Okay, we'll do it until the clock runs out or we run out of capability. Are you talking about? The clock runs out? Whose clock? Whose clock? There are only two players in this scenario, the Taliban and Biden. That's it. There are no other players. So whose clock are we talking about? Joe Biden's artificial timeline for getting out? Or are we now talking about the fact that the Taliban has set a clock for the United States to leave? And Joe Biden is going to obey the clock of, again, the worst people on planet Earth. These barbarians. That's who we're going to obey. Or our military capability runs out. Our military capability, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year on the United States military. Our capability runs out for doing what? Driving people to the airport in defiance of a ragtag group of people armed with like bicycle locks? Like what are you talking about? That's the Secretary of Defense of the United. That guy needs to be out. He needs to resign. Frankly, Biden should resign. I mean, he's not going to, obviously. And he's not going to be impeached by a Democratic Congress. But if anybody had any stones, they would. This is the most pathetic thing I've ever seen in my life as an American citizen. It is the most mewling, pathetic, disreputable thing I've ever seen in my life in terms of American foreign policy, and it is not close. And we saw a lot of crap under Barack Obama. This is abjectly pathetic. The State Department Press Secretary Wendy Sherman was asked about this yesterday, and she says, well, no government could evacuate all these citizens. No one could, really. I mean, when you think about it, it's really hard. Well, yeah, it is hard when you get rid of all the American troops that were protecting all the air bases that allowed people to leave. Yes, that does make it rather difficult, does it not? Maybe somebody should have conveyed that to the president. Or maybe, having conveyed that to the president, if he insisted on going ahead with his plan, somebody should have resigned in protest. Didn't we hear that a lot during the Trump administration? If you hate it so much, you should leave. Well, anyone? Bueller? Here's Wendy Sherman.
Kabul, I don't know if you've ever been there, is an enormous city. Enormous. And it has, in fact, had more and more people come to Kabul because they thought it was the safest place to be in Afghanistan. So it is difficult under any circumstances, and I don't know of any government that would be capable of reaching out to where everybody might be, particularly those who have not signed up to us to help them.
Which is why you shouldn't have surrendered the city. Lloyd Austin doubled down on this. The Secretary of Defense says, we don't have the capacity to collect our people. We just don't. We can't do it. Right? So originally, what was funny about this particular exchange is that Mark Milley, we'll get to in just 1 second, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's so concerned about white rage. White rage. It's really fortunate we have such geniuses running our military establishment. Nobody gets fired for losing wars around here. It's pretty impressive. You want to talk about a government make work program? Apparently, the Joint Chiefs of Staff is one of them. So is the Defense Secretaryship. So he started off this little exchange, Mark Milley, by saying this is a political problem. And then Lloyd Austin jumps in to save the president. And he says, no, it's not a political problem. It's a capacity problem.
I would draw a distinction, Barb, between extracting someone in an in extremis condition or circumstance versus going out and collecting up large numbers of American citizens.
Do you have the capability to go out and collect Americans?
We don't have the capability to go out and collect up large numbers of people.
We don't have the capability to collect them. Okay, you know what that capability amounts to? It amounts to literally you drive a car where the citizen is, you pick them up in your car, you bring them back to the airport. He's saying we can't do that. The reason they can't do that is because the Taliban have set up checkpoints. And so what they're really afraid of is that somebody will get into a shooting fight with the Taliban at the outskirts of the airport. And then the airport will be overrun by the Taliban. That is the fear. The fear is that America will attempt to deploy its forces into Kabul in order to pick up all the Americans, and the Taliban won't let them, and then you'll be in a shooting war. And Biden doesn't want that because he doesn't want to have to put troops back into Kabul and then have an urban fight with the Taliban in a city that he just conceded. So instead, we'll just leave the Americans out there. And then we'll hope that the Taliban are nice. And the Taliban will be nice so long as we pay them American taxpayer dollars so they can continue to propagate their evil regime of rape, torture, and tyranny. That's all that's happening here. The United States is now going to be the chief funder of the Taliban. That's what's going to happen. We are going to end up giving them the money because how else are we going to get our guys out? And why exactly would they let us get our guys out if that's the case? Meanwhile, Joe Biden had to be bullied by George Stephanopoulos into making a commitment to leave American troops there as long as necessary to get the Americans out. By the way, that's not going to happen. There are going to be Americans who get stuck in Afghanistan. I'm just saying that's going to happen right now. And if it doesn't happen, it's because Joe Biden's going to bribe the Taliban.
The commitment holds to get everyone out that, in fact, we can get out and everyone should come out. And that's the objective. That's what we're doing now. That's the path we're on. And I think we'll get there.
So Americans should understand that troops might have to be there beyond August 31st.
No, Americans should understand that we're going to try to get it done before August 31st.
But if we don't, the troops will stay.
If we don't, we'll determine at the time who's left.
And
if there are American forces, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Oh my God. You see, it's unbelievable how George Stephanopoulos has to walk him through that. Right? So he gives an answer. And his answer is basically, we'll determine at the end of the August 31st deadline who's left. And Stephanopoulos is like, what now? So you're saying that if there are Americans left, we might leave anyway? So he has to prompt Biden until he gets to the right answer there. And you just massage his ass until the correct answer comes popping out of there. So George Stephanopoulos is doing here. Amazing stuff. Okay, but don't worry. It's not just Joe Biden who ought to resign and Lloyd Austin, our pathetic defense secretary, who ought to resign. It's Mark Milley. It's the entire infrastructure. The entire infrastructure ought to be thrown out on their butts. I know what you're thinking. It's time to binge some more Ben Shapiro videos. Well, you are right. You should. But first, like and subscribe. Perfect. I'll see you in the next video.